Welcome to part 2 of Understanding the Alps. So we now know a little more about thermal development in the flatlands and how much weight and therefore momentum these moving columns of air have. So how does this affect us flying in the mountains? This is a side valley in the Zillertal. I've chosen this image as there are two important points to be made here. The first is a step-like effect of the terrain, creating a trigger point lower down, and the other will show a continuous fly up the mountain until it's forced to a trigger at the top. First of all, this west-facing side absorbs a lot of heating under the trigger point. This starts to heat up the forest and the valley bottom. As the heated area gets warmer, the air in contact with it becomes more buoyant. As the bubble of air rises, sticking to the slope, it then meets the trigger point, the end of the forested area where the ridge flattens off. As thermals do not like changes in direction, I'd expect it to be forced to release here from the ridge. The thermal here could be smaller and shorter lived as the source is smaller. Also, the thermal quality may be affected by the inversions lower down in the valley. As this thermal triggers, the air at ground level will be attracted to the thermal. So now let's move on to the continuous, unbroken ridge. Again, the forest will heat up and the air will start to rise up the slope. It may trigger on the end of the forested area, but it's more likely to continue to rise until it meets the peak, as the slope is quite flat with no obvious changes in direction. Thermals cannot go downhill, so the peak is the most likely trigger point on this mountain. This thermal will most likely be a little bigger, stronger and longer lasting. The reason for this is that the source is bigger, and as the thermal rises up the warm slope it picks up more energy. On perfect days with a strong lapse rate, it's not uncommon for thermals to be fed continuously by the sun. They will only start to produce less frequent cycles as the sun moves around, until the slope is at a very shallow angle to the sun. Even then a surprising late thermal could be released. This picture shows the two different thermals, their respective sizes and where they triggered from. The following shots show how inversions can block thermal development. We're going to use an example with a relatively low inversion just over the tops of the small mountains at around 2,100 meters. The ground warms the air in the usual way. It reaches a trigger point and rises. As soon as this parcel of air leaves the terrain, it already starts to cool, roughly 1 degree every 100 meters. When it meets the warmer layer of air, its progress is halted by this inversion. Things can get rough around here as the air is forced to roll and scud along the bottom of the inversion. The lift on the higher ridge is more likely to break through any inversions as the thermal has gained energy as it's travelled higher up the mountain. Although if flying here, you'd notice that it would also become rough, broken and weaker as the thermal struggles to break through. Once through, it will pick up more energy before it triggers. That's why, on more stable days, we'll always try to take lines through the bigger mountains, as there will be better thermal quality. A general rule is that the higher the mountain, the higher the lift will go. On some days on the Penken, it's possible for blue thermals to stop at around 2.8, and on the bigger mountains, clouds form at around 3,500 meters. This is due to this effect. This rule works really well when thermaling low down and the lift dies off. If you head back to the mountain at a higher point, you can usually step up through the inversion. It takes a little technique and some patience. So in the next part, we're going to see how this affects us in the real world.